I am Dr. Cory Saunders. I am a registered psychologist. I practice in the areas of neuropsychology, clinical psychology, and school psychology. My specialization is neurodevelopmental disorders of infancy and early childhood, as well as disorders of learning and children's mental health. And I'm currently the director of the OZED Institute, which focuses on research, education, and training in neurodevelopmental disorders. So I have the pleasure this morning of introducing our panel for our discussion today. So we have with us Dr. Lindsey Jaber, who is the editor of the book. She is an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Windsor. She's also a registered school clinical and counseling psychologist. Her research background is in mental health and she has extensive practice and experience providing clinical counseling and school psychology services to children, adolescents, and adults. She operates through an innovative scientist practitioner education framework, which informs her research, her work with clients, her clinical and research supervision, and her teaching in an iterative and integrative cycle. She passionately advocates for the mental health and wellness of everyone, including students, educators, staff, and leadership across kindergarten through 12 and in post-secondary settings. We also have one of our contributors, Marium Tolson-Murtty, who is a doctoral candidate. She is a dynamic post-secondary educator, an equity strategist, and a community leader whose work bridges scholarship, culture preservation, and transformative justice. She is a proud Windsor native and a descendant of the Underground Railroad. She is dedicated to advancing African Canadian histories and dismantling systemic inequities in education. She currently serves as the Director of Human Rights, Conflict Resolution, and Mediation at the University of Windsor, where she is leading the institution's inaugural anti-racism action plan, along with several additional anti-oppression initiatives. We also have with us Dr. Jennifer Slagus, who is one of our contributors. They are a neurodivergent assistant professor and social sciences librarian at West Chester University in Pennsylvania. Their research applies to critical neurodiversity studies, frameworks to children's literature, librarianship, and education. And we have finally Adrienne Kitchin, who is a PhD candidate in educational studies at Brock University, nearing the end of writing her dissertation. Her work is broadly within the field of medical humanities, looking at how counter narratives to dominant ideologies can contribute to better health outcomes for women. So thank you everyone for being here on our panel this morning, and let's get started. So I want to turn things over to Dr. Lindsey Jaber, who's going to kind of give us an overview of how this book came into being.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Cory, for moderating and getting us started here. And thank you so much to the contributors who were able to join today to share this really important work. I want to thank you for being here and also to the audience. So just to get started, I wanted to provide a very brief overview of the book and then sort of get into some of the specific chapters in the work that was done with our panelists here. Maybe come back to me if there's time before Q&A, but we want to have a lot of really good discussion at the end. So thank you to everyone. So just very briefly to say, how did this book get started? This was started about 4 years ago, and we're here. When I started at the University of Windsor after working in a school system as a school psychologist and practice for several years, I was first teaching an educational psychology course, which there are lots of textbooks and resources for. But then in my second year, I was able to teach the mental health and classroom course, which is a course within our Bachelor of Education program, so for teacher candidates. And when I was creating that course, I was looking everywhere for resources for the course, particularly like a book that would bring everything together in a Canadian context specifically. So I couldn't find that and had a great little chat with somebody from Canadian Scholars at CSSE, and off we went. So did the pitch and sent out a chapter, which the first chapter was actually about educator mental health and wellness and well-being, because I think that's very essential to the work that we do across K-12 and post-secondary education. And then put out a call for some wonderful folks from across Canada, so representing emerging, established, late career scholars, all outstanding experts in their fields, and lucky today to have someone with us. So for the book, if you're not familiar with it or seen it before, it is broken into two parts. So the first part is really about just a kind of broad overview and considerations, and then multiple perspectives around mental health and wellness within educational context. So in that section, we have chapters on Indigenous ways of knowing and knowledges related to mental health and wellness in schools. We have a chapter about queering the Canadian classroom. We have a chapter on anti-Black racism in education in relation to mental health, which Marium is here to share with us today. We have a chapter for me about educator mental health and wellness. Then we have one that specifically focuses on sort of the circle of support for students. So it looks at the students, families, including parents, siblings, and educators all working together to support the students' mental health, but also families that may be struggling with mental health and or educators as well, and how we can all work together in that way. Then we have one by Dr. Saunders here that's on neurodevelopmental perspectives of mental health. We have a specific chapter on ADHD and autism disorder. And then we have the last chapter in that section is about mental health, some of the common disorders and challenges that you would see, particularly in K to 12, but also in a post-secondary setting. So after that part, we get into more of the application pieces of the book. So we have a chapter about academic performance and mental health and the relationship between those two and how both are important for each other. We have a chapter on trauma-informed pedagogy. Many of you have probably heard a lot about that. There's been a lot of talk around trauma-informed care, trauma-informed pedagogy, trauma-sensitive practices. So there's a chapter about how to employ that within the classroom. There's a chapter on technology and mental health. So I'll really focus on social media, but also just different types of technology and different platforms and how that interacts with mental health. There's one on resilience, grit, and growth mindset. There's one on career development, so really focus on like kind of high school students, but how helping students decide their career paths and developing that can actually promote mental health and wellness in adolescence, in high school, and beyond. And we have a chapter with two of our other contributors here, Adrienne and Jennifer, on neurodiversity and sort of an environmental supportive classroom. And then the final chapter, which I co-authored with my friend Nancy Norman, is on social emotional learning based classroom strategies. So again, kind of like what can you do in the classroom to support mental health and social emotional development and well-being. Okay, taking a break. It's a lot. That's a lot to say. So so happy to be here. I did just want to mention I wasn't sure if I was, but I did really want to highlight that the book is in loving memory of Jennifer Cordero. So I didn't want to mention it, but I think it's very important. She was, at the time of writing the book, an experienced social worker in the community, a very strong advocate for kids, particularly those in foster care, and working with school systems to support their learning needs. Unfortunately, she passed away only several months before the book was published. But she was awarded her doctoral degree posthumously from the University of Windsor as well, which was her dream. So this is for you, Jen, wherever you are right now. Okay.
All right.
So yeah, you know what? Do you want me to stop there? Let's go on to Marium, and then I'm happy to circle back and have a sip of water. Thanks, Cory.
Oh, thank you, Lindsey. Marium, would you please give us a nice little overview of your chapter?
Yes, thank you. And let me just say, Lindsey, thank you for that acknowledgement of Jennifer. And I think I better stop there too before I start. But yeah, but good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And, thank you for the invitation to present insights from my chapter, from interest convergence to dismantling anti-Black racism in education, the edification of a teaching praxis. I thank Lindsey, Dr. Jaber, for providing the opportunity to illuminate on such a significant issue that many educators have either faced in silence or felt lack the agency to bring these issues to light. I thank you for this opportunity to join in on this collaboration. So this chapter is situated in the book, Understanding Mental Health Across Educational Contexts, and I got my copy right here, because conversations about student well-being cannot be divorced from conversations about systemic racism. As renowned education scholar George Day reminds us, race is central to understanding the social effects of oppression in education. So if we are to grasp the mental health challenges faced by students, particularly Black students, we must critically interrogate how racism functions within our schools. So much research and self-reflection went into the development of this chapter. I will preface what I'm about to present by saying that some information may present some hard truths that some educators, students, and participants that have tuned in today from various backgrounds may be hearing for the first time. So in this overview, I will quickly touch upon 6 key elements. So the first thing, what is the purpose of this chapter? So the chapter is guided by 4 key questions. So how does anti-Black racism manifest in schools? What are its impact on students? How can educators interrupt and disrupt these harms? And why must anti-racism practitioner work be central to teaching praxis? These questions aim to move the conversation from symbolic commitments to sustained systemic change. So this chapter is rooted in theoretical frameworks in Black crit, womenism, Black feminist thought, theory of multiculturalism, post-colonial theory, and critical race theories, interest convergence. Now, the term interest convergence is a concept developed by the late legal scholar Derek Bell and a key tenet of critical race theory, and reminds us that racial progress often happens only when it benefits those in power. In schools, this means anti-racism efforts are sometimes more about protecting institutional reputation than protecting students. The challenge is to move beyond that toward real, lasting change that centers student well-being and mental health. Secondly, the historical and structural foundations are important to recognize. So to understand present-day realities, we must understand historical continuities. Canada's K-12 system was constructed on a colonialist and segregationist framework, which included residential schools for Indigenous students and racially segregated schools for Black students. And as some of us may know, the last segregated school in Ontario closed in about 1965, and the last in Canada, located in Nova Scotia, not until around 1983. So this legacy persists today in academic streaming, disproportionate discipline, hypersurveillance, and Eurocentric curriculum. These are not anomalies, but systemic patterns that normalize marginalization and erasure. Now, number 3, the findings and the impact on students that I was able to come across as a result of research for this chapter. So the impact of anti-Black racism are profound and extend well beyond academic outcomes. For example, mental health. The American Psychological Association in 2020 declared racism a public health pandemic, underscoring its deep psychological and physiological toll. In Canada, the Mental Health Commission of Canada in 2021 has verified these concerns linking systemic racism and disproportionate rates of depression, anxiety, psychological distress among Black communities. Additionally, disengagement and push out. Also from Dr. George Day, he documented back in 1997, the dropout rates were as high as 42% amongst Black students in Toronto. And this was shaped not by a lack of ability, but by systemic hostility, streaming, and lower teacher expectations. And third, identity and belonging. Author Robin Maynard highlights how discriminatory treatment in schools leave Black students, youth, unwanted, unsupported, and devalued. These conditions erode self-esteem and shape negative identity development factors closely tied to mental health and resilience. In short, anti-Black racism in schools is not only an educational issue, it is a public health and mental health issue. 4, multiculturalism versus anti-racism. Another key element in what I call diluting the discourse is the problem of conflating multiculturalism with anti-racism. Canada often celebrates its cultural mosaic by multiculturalism, but celebrates its cultural heritage with in terms of its cultural mosaic, but multiculturalism has largely been performative rather than transformative. Too often, schools equate inclusion with symbolic displays, flags in hallways, cultural food, fairs, and what has been described as the sorry samosas and steel drums approach. While well-intentioned, these gestures do not disrupt structural inequalities. As the Ontario Provincial Advisory Committee on Race Relations has noted, as early as 1987, multiculturalism has not succeeded in addressing racial inequality and power and privilege in schools. Number 5, some recommendations and pathways for change. So this chapter advances several recommendations, which start with teacher education. Faculties of education must prepare teacher candidates to understand the social construction of race and their own positionality. This includes coursework in critical race theory, whiteness studies, and culturally responsive pedagogy. Additionally, professional practice. Teachers must reject colorblind approaches. As Eduard Bonilla Silva in 2010 argues, color blindness perpetuates racism and ignoring lived realities. Instead, educators must actively name and disrupt racist practices. Furthermore, focus on well-being. Schools must recognize that racism undermines not only academic achievement, but also mental health and well-being. Anti-racism work is health work. Continuous development. Teachers should engage in ongoing professional learning. For example, the Ontario's additional qualification courses in anti-Black racism, for example, while adopting trauma-informed and culturally responsive pedagogy. And from allyship to practitionership, anti-racism must move beyond symbolic allyship or photo opportunities. It requires sustained commitment to deep reflection and active disruption of systemic harm. And lastly, my 6th point, why does this chapter matter? Well, this book is about understanding mental health across educational contexts. My chapter underscores that Black students' mental health challenges are not separate from their educational experiences. They are shaped by them. Repeated microaggressions, discriminatory discipline, and curricular erasure produce trauma and disengagement. If we ignore the role of racism, we risk pathologizing students rather than addressing the systems that harm them. As Cameron and Jeffries in 21 assert, institutional racism continues to negatively shape the trajectories of Black lives. Addressing this reality is therefore not optional, it is foundational to any meaningful discussion on mental health and education. So in closing, the late bell hooks reminds us that the classroom remains the most radical space of possibility in the academy. That possibility rests on educators' willingness to do the hard work of transformation. If we commit to anti-racism as an integral part of teaching praxis, classrooms can shift from sites of exclusion to sites of healing, belonging, and liberation. This is why this chapter is in this book, because dismantling anti-Black racism is not simply an equity project. It is a mental health imperative. Thank you.
Thank you, Marium. That is that is beautiful, and that quote from bell hooks is certainly wonderful. I mean, it really focuses on what the whole, I think, underlying message of the book is in terms of how do we do what's best to make the best possible classrooms and learning environments for kids. And I think that's wonderful. So I will go next and talk a little bit about kind of my contribution along with Dr. Jaber. Really what our focus was with this chapter was really thinking about how we can look at how the brain is kind of dynamic, and it interacts with its environment around us and how that shapes each individual person, the sum of those interactions between their brain and how that brain development occurs. And I think we often look at, oh, we can have children who have different types of neurodevelopmental disorders, whether they be learning disabilities or ADHD or any number of different things that are brain related, but we don't look at the impact that that bidirectional relationship has, um, with respect to how does that impact their functioning in the classroom? How does the classroom interaction impact their mental health? How does their mental health impact the way in which they interact with their environment? And it becomes a very complicated interaction between all of these factors, that certainly then affects the way in which those kids experience learning within that environment. So it became very important to say, how do we take those sort of experiences of learning and how does that change brain development over time? And we know that there are functional issues, for example, that are associated with individual ability patterns. So we have kids that have strengths with language or strengths with visual and hands-on capabilities, for example. But then the environmental factors that come into play can further complicate how that all plays out for them in the classroom. So we know that having adverse childhood experiences can actually change the way in which the brain develops. And the way in which the brain is developing then impacts our further interactions with our environment. So the more we can do to ensure an environment that is meeting the needs of the kids within the classrooms with respect to their individual strengths and weaknesses with respect to processing, the better we can do at sort of ameliorating some of those negative effects that could potentially happen in those environments. So, a lot of what was looked at in the chapter was kind of looking at different types of patterns that kids could have. Like we start out with kids, for example, who have auditory processing and language-based weaknesses. And what does that look like in terms of diagnoses? But then how does that impact their mental health? How does their mental health affect their language processing and functioning? But then how does their language processing functioning affect their mental health? And we then looked at it with respect to, say, visual, spatial, and motor functions. So again, how does that impact how they're interacting with others in their environment? How are they processing social cues and things like that? And how is that then affecting mental health? And then looking at some of the executive functions in terms of how kids are processing information at a more executive level and how does that contribute to how they're interacting. And we know that often when kids have problems in one area, they more than likely have problems in another area. So we can have a lot of different things going on, which makes every student within that environment an individual that we sort of need to address their needs differently. Um, we also took a look at kids who have intellectual developmental disorders, to really look at what sorts of patterns are they experiencing in terms of their interactions with the environment and how does that impact their mental health. So looking at all these potential problems kids can have from a neurodevelopmental perspective really sort of communicates to us the importance of understanding each individual child. And so when we think about how are we going to interact with those kids within the classroom, one of the first things we look at is why are we seeing what we're seeing in the classroom? When we look at those kids, it's not just, oh, that kid is not paying attention, therefore that must be ADHD. And we just chalk it up to that and say, let's go get them a prescription for a stimulant. What we're saying is their behavior is communication. Their behavior is communicating that there is uh, an incompatibility between where they are currently at and what their capabilities are in that moment and what the expectations are in the classroom. And we need to make sure the capabilities are meshing with the expectations for them to function well. And if they're not functioning well, it's telling us that there's something wrong with our approach, not that there's something wrong with the way in which the student is learning. And the better way that we can sort of figure that out, we're going to do a lot better. So we need to really understand that etiology. and to really be able to look at those kids who present with something that is what I like to call more of an invisible disability, where we don't really see the problem because it's not showing up every time they open a book to try to read, for example, like a reading disorder. But when they have anxiety and they're the quiet child who sits in the back of the classroom, who's constantly in their head, how is that impacting them, and what can we do in the classroom as an educator to help those kids perform better? Um, so I look at it in terms of an overview that, diagnosis is great and it's a good way for professionals to communicate, but we should always make sure that we never fail to actually see the child, because every child is unique and every brain is unique and every individual has individual strengths and weaknesses that are going to impact their performance and impact their mental health. And in turn, the mental health is going to impact how they present in the classroom. So the more we can learn and understand about our kids and make sure we're meeting their needs in a classroom and having a classroom that is inclusive to all learning styles and all needs, and making sure their environment meshes with their capabilities, the best outcomes are going to come from that. So that is my little review of all of that. So what I'd like to do now is turn it over to Jennifer and Adrienne and tell us a little bit about neurodiversity and how that gets worked into inclusive classrooms.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to comment that the order of how these all flow together today works well because a lot of what you were sharing, Cory, kind of leads well into understanding the chapter that Adrienne and I wrote together. Our chapter is called Welcoming the Weird and Wonderful, Creating Classroom Environments That Support Neurodiversity. And I do think that for a lot of the reasons that everyone has shared today, it's an important chapter, but it's especially a popular topic now. Positively, there are more people who are trying to create inclusive environments, and they'll talk a lot about neurodiversity and disability, but thinking of ways that we can do that intentionally without it being tokenizing. Especially in the current political climate. I'm from the US, and so I am multiply neurodivergent with ADHD, autistic sensory processing disorder, and spatial sequence synesthesia. And it's just a wild time to hear this week US leadership and appointed health professionals who are saying that autism is caused by Tylenol and that autistic kids will never play baseball or will never live a normal life. And just seeing how harmful that language is and how our language use and understanding of neurodivergence, why that matters and how we can do better to support our young people. Sorry if you hear my cat. He just came up. The joys of at-home presentations. Sorry. So one thing I wanted to preface was the learning objectives that we hoped to cover in this chapter. So we go through defining the term of neurodiversity along with a few other key terms, and seeing how the understanding of those terms helps us to use informed language about neurodivergence and disabled people in the classroom. And the third objective was to identify the ways that we can support the neurodivergent spectrum in the classroom and beyond. So we mainly address this in thinking of ways to approach the classroom as neurodiversity informed educators and how we can create neurodivergent friendly environments that integrate and embrace students' differences without tokenizing their experience. So in the first part of the chapter, we go through the overview of those key terms. So defining neurodiversity really as just diversity in any other sense of what humans fall into. So just like racial and sexual and gender diversity, neurodiversity fits in the same way. All of our brains and bodies and way of being are different, and we're all part of neurodiversity. So we set that scene and then describe how people may identify, like myself, as neurodivergent, where we may have some experiences like being autistic or having ADHD that put our way of being into this kind of divergent category of being different than the very slim definition of normal, but it puts us over there. And then folks who wouldn't identify that way being neurotypical. So going through these terms and describing the neurodivergent spectrum as well, and trying to move the way that we're conceptualizing that away from this kind of really straight line of someone being low functioning or high functioning, and understanding the neurodivergent spectrum more like a color wheel where there are different sections that represent different experiences like sensory sensitivity or mental health challenges, and how we kind of flex, every person flexes within those from day to day, and how our environment affects that. And when we're making that kind of mental shift away from this very static, like, are you high or low functioning, which is the antiquated and harmful way of thinking about it, how we can better understand that everybody fits within this spectrum and that some people have just some more or less difficulties in different ways, and how that shift is moves us into a new paradigm of what Dr. Nick Walker has theorized as the neurodiversity paradigm. And so we propose that critical paradigm as a way that educators could better understand human diversity and talk about it in new and respectful ways, recognizing that there's no right brain or body or way of being, in the same way that there is no right race or right gender. There is no right way of being neurologically or mental health wise in the classroom, and trying to value students as they are. So that really carries over into our language use, how we welcome them within the classroom environment, whether we're calling someone autistic or saying they are a person with autism, and kind of separating that, just the different ways we talk about it, how that can really change the welcoming, like how welcoming our environments are. And once we have that foreground of understanding it, the language that we use, it kind of moves into the actual physical environment and how the classroom itself can be welcoming or not to different body minds. So that's where Adrienne's specialty came into our chapter. So I'll pass it over to you for that.
Great. Thanks so much, Jen. And thank you, Lindsey, as well, for the opportunity. This has been one of the most enjoyable aspects of being in this PhD program that I'm currently in with Marium, and Jen has just completed. And so my part in this chapter follows what Jen was saying, and it actually follows really nicely, as you were saying, Jen, in terms of the lineup of how we've been speaking here, and looking at how one of my initial research interests was learner affect and classroom environments, and how classroom environments affect learner affect. And so as I started looking into that, I began really delving into the space of feminist new materialisms and looking at researchers, scholars like Karen Barad, Jane Bennett, who talks about, and I have this quoted in the chapter as well, the curious ability of inanimate things to produce effects dramatic and subtle. So we're talking about how a learning space that has material objects in that space and the way that the space is set up, how might these affect different body minds? And as Jen said, we're all on a spectrum of being neurally diverse. And so we can all benefit from a creative look at thinking about what are the types of ways we can set up a classroom for learners that may consider or do consider, the broad spectrum of neurodiversity, but also neurodivergence. And so one of the things that I thought was really fascinating is that Karen Barad, who is a feminist new materialist, they talk about how when we think of these, clear boundaries between material objects and other things, that those boundaries aren't as clear and solid as we think, so they'll give the example of, if you're holding a coffee cup, it's not that, there's X number of atoms in the hand and Y number of atoms in the cup. So boundaries blur, and they blur for all of us. But for neurodivergent learners who are, perhaps more sensitive to sound or, aspects of maybe lighting or other elements, this kind of situation where neurodivergent learners can experience overstimulation in the classroom, what we talk about is how the anxiety, stress, and physical pain that this overstimulation can cause are real. So we looked at, and I was looking at, what are some ways that we can, think creatively to help support classroom environments, to lessen this, pain, stress, and anxiety that can result from things like overstimulation. And so I found that there was a really, great movement towards designing learner space. And I found this award-winning architectural company, Verona and Carpenter, and they have some really lovely ideas. They can design spaces from the ground up, but also what can we do? Many of us are in these, spaces that are based on models that have, structural inequities already built into the way the space has been constructed. So we provide some tips in the chapter about, what are some things we can do, like providing zoned lighting or lessening the overhead lighting, and doing things like maybe even using space in a slightly different way. If there's any way we can branch out maybe into the hallway to offer students who are overstimulated a bit of time to, just regenerate and have some quiet moments. So thinking about flexibility, versatility, and, challenging what we think about the word weird, right? Because weird can also be wonderful, not just in terms of what we might think about other people, but also, in our spaces where we do our teaching and learning. The weird might just be wonderful, by using that space in creative and different ways. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer and Adrienne. That was a wonderful synopsis of your chapter. I think what you were hitting on was really, really important. The whole idea of like thinking about diagnosis and disability and the idea of them being very negative and highlighting what's wrong with people, as opposed to really looking at their experiences of diversity as a human being, and the fact that often a diagnosed disability is a reflection of a person's inability to function within their environment. So it's often environmentally driven, and we really have to look at how do we change that environment so that, as Marium said, you don't want to have a teacher who is colorblind. You also don't want to have one that is, disability blind and saying everybody is equal in this classroom, because individuals who have neurodiversity have had a different set of experiences, and we need to sort of understand that. So what we really need is an inequity informed classroom across the board, and something that is inclusive, so that we can promote the well-being of everybody, and really promote mental health in terms of what it truly means within the classroom. We have a few minutes left. Dr. Jaber, would you like to give a small synopsis?
I wasn't sure if there's questions yet. I was just going to very briefly touch on a couple of things that I had been meant to say at the beginning, but then went off track there slightly. But that just said the book overall, and I think everybody sort of summed it up, and I think the different talks today really show it. Really, the idea is really to support like mental health and well-being and wellness for everyone, in the classroom, in the school setting, outside the school, in the community. And how important it is that by talking about it, understanding it, and learning more about it, the more we can reduce the stigma and the huge negative impact that can have on people's and systems across K-12 and post-secondary. So I think that's a really nice way of looking at it, and I think all of the chapters really delve into that and trying to address those more systemic issues and moving away from the individual pathologizing of students. There was one other point. Oh, I was going to say too, one thing. If you read the book, you would know. But one of the things that we really considered too was the term educator. And so that's defined in there too. And wanting to really make sure that this book was not for teachers, and not just teacher candidates, so like those in BEd programs, but really for all educators. So including leadership, administration, support staff, other school staff, and people working in higher education things. And because to have a mentally healthy and well and flourishing school where people belong, everyone has to be involved at all levels. And so I think across the book, that's a key item that keeps coming up. And like, how do we encourage that for everyone, so that it is not a tokenistic check the box, we have mental health, and that we really are truly doing the work. So thank you again to all of you here today and to all of the contributors to make this such a, I hope, a very excellent resource for many different individuals working across education. And I don't know if there's questions, I can't see them. So Cory, are you able to see those?
I can take a look here right now. So let's just go here. Well, how about we start with, from your perspective, what is it about teaching that makes it a caring profession? Dr. Jaber.
That one's for me. Okay, thank you. Can you see the actual question, or does Emma need to? Yeah, you can. Okay,
I got it. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. That is an excellent question, Dr. Saunders. I think, and I think we've moved more in that direction. I think there are many more people talking about teaching and learning as a caring profession. Nell Noddings, has an excellent resource and book about teaching as a caring profession. And I think as mental health and anti-racist practice and become more talked about, more looked at, we also see that teachers are being asked to do a lot, and because they need to. And so I think that goes hand in hand with like educators' mental health and wellness and how important that is, because I think the job of a teacher has shifted from decades ago, where your expectation was you just went in and you taught and everything else was not your problem or your business or and that really has shifted. And I think if you approach teaching from an ethic of care, kind of regardless of what you're teaching or the students in the classroom or what you're supporting, then you're going to do the best that you can do as an educator. And as long as you are learning and doing the work, it's really important. But it can be a lot for teachers. And I know, working with teacher candidates, I know lots of teachers, it can lead to their own mental health challenges and burnout. Teacher burnout is very, very high. A huge number of teachers leave the profession within the first 5 years. So again, we have to kind of like think of everybody's mental health and wellness and safety within the school setting. And I don't know if that answered that question.
Is that excellent?
I'm going to stick with that. Thanks.
All right. So here's the next question. Wondering what the panelists think is needed in order to support this work, especially in the context of fiscal austerity in education, both K-12 and higher education.
I can take that just very briefly, because I do work in the post-secondary college sector, and austerity is very real. And I know for sure for K-12, there is that as well. And I have no easy answers, because as Lindsey says, teaching is by nature, it is a caring profession, and burnout can be real. And so now when you're faced with austerity measures, that is an additional layer where, maybe you can see the answers or what could be used, and yet, the funding or resources aren't there. So I empathize with that very deeply. And one of the things that Jen and I put in our chapter were things like, and I know it's not the answer for everything, but that maybe thrifting things, and this might be on the teacher themselves, like, just to do things like creating the lighting, or offering some an additional rug that could absorb some noise. So it's not there's no easy answer there. It is a real problem because there is so much needed, and so much that can be done. But in the face of austerity, that becomes even more complicated. So those are more my comments, not an answer, but just some comments. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's a very difficult position to be in because funding is it's not like more money is coming. So what ends up happening then is that focus is put on, well, what do we need to focus on? And within the education system, it's often seen as it's the educating component. But I think what people don't realize is that in order to have a good outcome from an educational standpoint, the classroom has to be set up to facilitate optimal functioning for the people who are in it. You can have the best teacher in the world and the best resources and the best books and everything. And if you have a child who is really, really struggling due to a mental health concern, that child is not going to learn. So it really, I think, is going to take some sort of reprioritizing at another level. So
Yeah, if I could add briefly, I think that the idea that we talk in our chapter about making the paradigm shift about neurodivergence is the same thing that needs to happen. But it's hard because the care doesn't really align with the going back to the other question too, and thinking of this all together. The administrators and folks who could make decisions about this often aren't thinking about that. And so, as you said, Cory, like if we can't foreground care and the way that people actually can exist within the room, it's really hard to think about the bigger picture of actually trying to learn anything. But at present, I don't think that care aligns with the approach to fiscal austerity or responsibility in many people's perspective. And so making that shift at the higher levels feels like what needs to happen. And a lot of times at the end of I get to the end of whatever I'm researching, and I say that the thing I need to teach people how to do is to care about each other, and I don't know how to do that. And that really would fix a lot of problems, but it's not really a helpful thing that we can go forth and do other than to love each other as much as we can on a one-to-one basis.
And if I may, I think I want to go off of what Jennifer was just saying, because I hear that too in terms of the austerity measures that are in play where I am in post-secondary as well, and working on, action plans and initiatives. And my response based on my chapter that I contributed towards, and my thing is, anti-racism work is probably one of the most cost-effective things you can do in terms of it sounds oversimplistic, but just stop being racist and stop, being discriminatory in the classroom with students, with colleagues, and things of that nature. Just have that level of awareness and learn about what is it that students that are experiencing racial trauma, what that is and how they're bringing it into the classroom. I don't think that takes extra resources, maybe a little bit more invested time on the part of the educator to know what the student has been experiencing, and also to know what those systemic issues are within the educational system or within your school or so on and so forth. But I don't think there needs to be a budget line item for individuals to be a better human being, and to use anti-racism practices within their teaching practice. So I'll just leave it there.
okay, there's been a number of questions that have come in actually regarding parents, and would this book be a helpful resource to help parents better understand some issues around children's mental health and what students may be experiencing, or how it's raising a child with a disability or a mental health disability, and how that parent needs to partner with the teachers and the educators to really have positive outcomes. Lindsey?
I'll jump in. I'll jump in first on that one, just because I did write the chapter or co-write the chapter around not like looking at parent mental health and that impacting families, but also on that whole idea of like the student and the parents and the teachers in the school system, how imperative it's that they all do work together, and that parents are involved and schools are involving parents in the discussions about their child, who they also know probably better than anyone else. I mean, the teacher sees them for a number of days and they see it, but they're home with parents, you know, the rest of the time. And so they're that perspective and the engagement is so important. And I hope that the book would be helpful for parents. I mean, it's geared more towards like educators and such, but I think it's written in a way, hopefully, that is pretty accessible to everyone and would help to provide not just a general overview of mental health and in particular school, but also some of the things that are going on in education in schools to help support and promote mental health. So I think I would be hopeful. I hope it's helpful in that way. But that one chapter particularly, I think, you know, Dr. Cordero and I really focus on, like, if you're really working in silos, like the students over here and the teachers are over here and the parents are over here, and often from experiencing it, they're actually against each other. Like everybody's kind of fighting against each other as opposed to like joining together in conversations and joining together in planning. It can make a huge difference. And from firsthand experience, I've seen parents and administrators and teachers who were just like at complete odds. And when they took the time to sit and listen and really hear what everybody, including the student, was experiencing and had to contribute and had to say, worlds of difference for that student, for the relationship with the teacher, with the relationship with the school. And I think it's, again, goes back to like that care and wanting and taking the time to listen, which again it's hard when you have so many students, you know, and there's so much going on in the schools. But I think if you can make that time, parents in particular can feel heard and feel like they want to join with you as the teacher in the school to support what's best. I'll stop there and let others jump in.
Collaboration and a shared experience and a shared approach, I think, just highlights that it's so needed. Anyone else want to jump in on that one? All right. Let's see. Okay. So you highlight the need for embedding anti-racism praxis in teacher education. What role do theoretical frameworks like Black Crit or Black Feminist Thought play in shaping practical tools for educators? Marium.
Yes, I think that is important to look at in terms of it in looking at those theoretical frameworks for embedding practices, because first of all, if you are not taking those theoretical concepts into consideration, if you're not thinking about things critically, if you're not addressing certain situations and just how sort of the machine of the K-12 system or even the post-secondary system, how that operates and how it works and how it's impacting certain segments of the student population, then you're really not addressing the root of the issue. You're not really getting to the point where you're dismantling. So if you're not understanding it from the perspective, then there's really no getting to the root. Then that's where sort of the performativity comes into play. So if it's just continuously surface level without getting into the research and to the heart and to why it just keeps being perpetuated, then you're not really going to develop sustainable change. And that's all part of why it's necessary to embed these systems. So as I mentioned, you know, the sorry samosa steel drum approach, and like I said, even though that's well-intentioned, and you know, multiculturalism and the theory of multiculturalism, for example, and celebrating diversity, all of that is great, wonderful, and fantastic. But then once those celebrations are over and you have a child going back into the classroom and still experiencing racial slurs and microaggressions, then really how far have you really gotten in terms of addressing the matter at hand? So you really have to learn and explore what these critical theories are, how to bring them to the forefront and how to sort of put them into your arsenal in terms of becoming an anti-racism practitioner, which is just overall becoming a better educator overall. That should just be part of the process, not necessarily an add-on or a checkbox. But if it's just part of who you are becoming as an educator, then there's really no need to really think that it's secondary. It's part of the everyday process of who you are in terms of bringing your educational or educator lens to your particular teaching and learning environment.
Okay, excellent. Well,
Thanks. Can I add one thing? That was great, Marium. Something that was coming to mind as you were talking is thinking about how we actually do that, and how to move beyond the surface level. And one of the things that came to mind is we were talking a bit about not seeing color, not seeing disability. We need to see those things in every instance all the time, right? Everything is about race and racism, especially here in the US. Everything is about it. And when we don't, even this morning, I watched a TikTok of a person who said that they are a forager, and how their tag is Black forager. And people were like, well, why do you have to bring race into it? And they explain about how on plantations, and once they were able to have their own land and get out of that system, like what it meant for Black bodies to be using the land to to find their own food instead of food for someone else. And that's why it matters every day, all the time today. And so it's uncomfortable for people who haven't broken that down to recognize that it's embedded into everything, every system. And if we can try to at least see it, that's how we can be able to better support disabled students, students struggling with mental health, our Black students, everyone around us. But I think we have to see it. And that's one way we can kind of get at what you're talking about, I think. But thank you.
one last question here, Lindsey. It says you discussed that one needs a multidimensional approach to mental health education. I think this is very important. Can you speak any more to that?
In 30 seconds. I think we're really coming up on the end of the thing, but that's a really good question. I guess, that's a big question too. I think, and I think you see it in the book that there are different ways, particularly let's talk about like mental health or mental health challenges and disorders. I mean, we have the medical model, there's disability studies, there's feminist studies, there's, different queer studies, indigenous knowledges around mental health. And I think that's a real strength of the book, is that it does really show all of these different ways of looking at mental health and wellness and well-being. And maybe trying to take the focus away more from the medical model of mental health and disorders, and that pathologizing of the individual, the student or teacher, whoever it may be experiencing those challenges. So I will say there are disorders in there. We do talk about like anxiety and depression and like autism spectrum disorder and ADHD. And that's more because those terms, that way of thinking is still fairly prominent, in particularly in the health medical industry, but within education too. So we sort of try to balance what are these disorders that you might see being diagnosed and coming into your classroom, so that you have an understanding of what is an anxiety disorder, but really framing that in that this is a much larger systemic issue with many, many people who need to be involved in the conversation beyond just psychologists or psychiatrists who have, predominantly been the ones leading the talk and around mental health. Don't know if that answers the question. That's the best I can do, and I think we have -minutes now. So thanks. I'll let Cory wrap up, but thank you again to everybody for being here.
Yes, thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists, Lindsey, Jennifer, Adrienne, Marium, and it's been wonderful to discuss the book today.